The Harrison household was the kind of home that the whole neighborhood talked about, not because it was the largest on the street or the most beautifully decorated, but because everyone who stepped through its front door could sense, even before they sat down, that something important happened inside those walls. Decisions were made there. Futures were shaped there. And, though nobody said it out loud, fates were sealed there too. Robert Harrison had built his life from nothing, and he wanted everyone to know it. He had arrived in Atlanta at 22 with a beat-up Civic, $400 in his wallet, and an ambition so fierce it could have swallowed the entire city whole. 40 years later, he owned 2 auto dealerships in the suburbs, a strip mall in Marietta, and a regional trucking company that moved freight across 8 states. He was a man of substance, and he wore that knowledge like a second skin. More importantly, he needed the people around him to wear it too. His wife, KARL Harrison, was the quiet engine of the family, the woman who woke before 6 every morning, who made enormous Sunday dinners that drew the whole extended family to the table, who could tell which of her children was struggling before they had found the words for it themselves. She was the kind of woman who holds a family together with the invisible thread of her patience, her love, and her endless sacrifice. But even she, with all her grace and wisdom, had never found a way to fix the one great wound at the heart of her home. That wound had a name: Brandon. Brandon was the firstborn son, and in Robert Harrison's worldview, that position carried the weight of the heavens. He was tall, confident, and possessed of that particular charm that makes rooms go quiet when someone enters. He had studied business at Georgia Tech, graduated near the top of his class, and now ran the operations side of Harrison Freight with the kind of smooth authority that made his father beam every time they shared a room. By any measure, Brandon was a success. The problem was not Brandon himself. The problem was what his success had done to his father, and what his father's pride had done to the rest of the family. Below Brandon were 2 other children: Diane, the second-born daughter who was 28, and a high school biology teacher in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Marcus, the last-born son, 24 years old, restless, artistic, and perpetually on the wrong side of his father's expectations. Diane had learned at the age of 12 that certain things in their household were simply not available to her. Not food, not shelter, those were plentiful enough. What was scarce was the particular kind of attention that came wrapped in pride, the kind announced at barbecues and holiday gatherings, the kind that lived in the way a father's chest expands when he introduces a child to his colleagues and business partners. She remembered the day her SAT scores came back. 1,480. She had printed the results at the school library and practically floated home, her heart hammering the whole way, already imagining her father's face. She burst through the back door and found him in the living room watching football with 2 of his friends from the Rotary Club. Dad, I got a 1480 on the SAT. He had looked up briefly, nodded once, the way one acknowledges a mildly interesting detail in a news broadcast, and said, "Good. Brandon hit 1510 when he was your age." Then he turned back to the television. She had stood there for a long moment, the printout going limp in her suddenly sweaty hand. Then she had walked quietly to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and told herself, as she would tell herself many times over the next decade and a half, that it didn't matter, that she was fine, that she didn't need his approval to know her own worth. She was lying, of course, it mattered enormously. And she was not fine. Marcus's story was different in texture, but identical in weight. He had never been conventionally academic, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his mind moved in directions that had no standardized test. He could look at a blank wall and see a mural. He could walk through a city and read its personality the way other people read words on a page. He had spent his teenage years filling sketchbooks that his father dismissed as doodling, and his early 20s trying to build a graphic design and illustration business that Robert flatly refused to acknowledge as a real career. "You want to make drawings for a living? Robert had said at the Sunday dinner table 3 years ago, after Marcus had turned down a management trainee position at one of the dealerships. While your brother is building an actual company, you want to throw away every opportunity I work to give you? Marcus had said nothing. He had learned too early that silence was the only safe language in that house, for anyone who was not Brandon. The Thanksgiving of that year was when everything cracked open, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the slow, inevitable give of something that had been under pressure for far too long. The whole family had gathered at the house in Buckhead, Robert and KARL, Brandon and his wife Jennifer, Diane, who had driven down from Charlotte, and Marcus, who had taken an early morning flight and arrived looking like he hadn't slept, which he hadn't. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends filled the house. There was football on every television, the smell of turkey and sweet potato pie in every room, and the particular warmth of extended family that only happens at a table crowded enough that someone always has to pull up an extra chair. It was during the afternoon lull, after the plates had been cleared and the pecan pie was being sliced, that Robert Harrison stood and tapped his wine glass with a knife. The room went quiet. When Robert spoke, the room listened. That had always been the arrangement. "I want to say a few words," he began, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man who has rehearsed this moment many times. "As you all know, I'm not getting any younger." Easy laughter from the room. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about everything I've spent my life building and where it goes from here." He paused. "So I've made a decision. Effective January 1st, Brandon will be named CEO of Harrison Freight. He will hold controlling interest in the dealerships and serve as chair of the family trust." The applause was immediate. Brandon stood, gracious and smiling, and embraced his father. Jennifer wiped her eyes. The uncles clapped each other on the back. Robert beamed with the full, unguarded brightness of a man who believes he has just done something right. And in the middle of all that noise, in the middle of all that celebration, Diane sat completely still. She was not crying. That surprised her. She had half-expected tears, but what she felt instead was something colder and more settled. A confirmation. Not shock. Confirmation. As if a truth she had been quietly carrying for 15 years had finally been given its proper name, loudly, in front of everyone she had ever loved. Marcus, sitting beside her, found her hand under the table. She let him hold it. Later, after the toasts and the photographs, Diane found her mother in the kitchen, moving slowly through the familiar motions of wrapping leftovers, the methodical calm KARL always summoned when she was upset. "Mun." "Diane," her mother didn't turn around. "Did you know he was going to do this?" A long pause, the sound of plastic wrap pulling off the roll. "Your father makes his own decisions." "That's not what I asked." KARL set a dish down carefully and finally turned. Her eyes were red at the edges, which told Diane everything she needed to know. "I asked him to talk to you both first. I told him it wasn't right to just announce it in front of everyone without—" She stopped, took a breath. "He said, Brandon is the oldest, and that's how these things are done." "That's how these things are done," Diane repeated softly, tasting each word. "I have been teaching kids biology for 6 years, Mom. I spent my own money, 2 years of it, buying lab supplies because the school budget was cut. I built something real. And Marcus, his design business, is actually growing. He has clients in London and Toronto. Did Dad even know that?" "I told him." "And?" KARL said nothing. She turned back to the counter. That silence was its own complete answer. It would be easy in a story like this to make Brandon the villain. He was not. That was what made everything so much more complicated. Brandon knew. He had always known, with the exquisite, uncomfortable sensitivity of someone who is loved too visibly in a room where others are loved too little. He had watched, year after year, the way his father's attention tracked him whenever he entered a room, a constant, warm spotlight, while Diane and Marcus existed in the gentler, dimmer glow of general family love. He had watched and he had felt, simultaneously, the unbearable pleasure of being the chosen one and the gnawing guilt of knowing what that favor cost the people who shared his blood. 2 nights after Thanksgiving, when the house had finally gone quiet, Brandon knocked on the guest room door where Diane was staying. "Come in," she said. He sat at the foot of the bed in the semi-darkness, neither of them reaching for the lamp. Outside, the neighborhood was still. "I didn't ask for it," he said. "I know. I want you to understand that Brandon," she said his name quietly without anger. "I know you didn't engineer this. I know you're a good person. But you have to understand something." She sat up against the headboard. "The problem isn't you. The problem is never you. The problem is that for 30 years, Dad has looked at this family and seen a ranking, a hierarchy. And we, Marcus and I, we have been ranked below you. Not because of anything we did wrong, but because of what we are. A daughter, a son who doesn't fit the mold he built in his head." She paused. "And you have never once said a word to him about it." Brandon was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know what to say." "You run a company," she said, and there was the faintest ghost of a smile in her voice. "You give presentations. You negotiate." He laughed, short and uncomfortable. Then the laughter faded, and what remained was the truth of it sitting in the darkness between them. "I was scared," he admitted, "that if I pushed back, he would, I don't know, see me differently." "Yes," Diane said softly. "That fear of losing his approval." "I understand that fear too, Brandon. The difference is that you had everything to lose. Marcus and I were never in much danger of having his approval to begin with. Marcus had always processed the world through images. When he was angry, he drew. When he was sad, he designed." The week after Thanksgiving, he sat in the small home office his parents kept for guests and worked through the night on something he hadn't planned. Something that poured out of him like water from a pipe that had been sealed for too long. It was a series of 6 illustrations. Each depicted the same family scene from a different angle. A father standing at the center, his gaze and light fixed entirely on the tallest of his 3 children, warm golds and ambers streaming from him toward the eldest, while the other 2 stood in careful blues and cool grays, their faces patient, their postures quietly resigned. Stalled, the series simply hierarchy. He hadn't planned to show anyone, but Diane found him in the morning, asleep at the desk with his head on his arms and the illustrations spread around him. She stood over them for a long, quiet moment. Then she woke him gently. "Marcus, these are extraordinary." He blinked, disoriented, looked at what his hands had made through the night, felt suddenly, nakedly exposed. It was something to do. I wasn't really... "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't you dare call it nothing." That morning, Carol came in to say goodbye before Diane's drive back to Charlotte. She stopped when she saw the illustrations arranged on the desk. She said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Then she sat down in the chair by the window, pressed both hands over her mouth, and cried quietly, with great composure, the way Carol Harrison did everything. When she gathered herself, she looked at Marcus and said, "Show these to your father." "Man, show him." Robert Harrison looked at the illustrations for a very long time. He was sitting in his study behind his wide oak desk, and Marcus stood in front of him the way he always had in that room, like a kid called to the principal's office. His father moved from one image to the next without speaking, and Marcus watched him and braced for the dismissal. "For is this how you spend your time? For I don't understand what I'm looking at." What he did not brace for was silence. Robert sat with the 6th illustration, the one showing the 2 shadowed figures from behind, watching the golden one from a distance, for so long that Marcus's legs began to ache. The clock on the wall ticked. A car passed outside. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Then Robert set the illustration down, pressed both hands flat on the desk, and said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Who's the man in the middle?" Marcus blinked. That's Brandon, Dad." "And the one on the left? The one whose face we can't see?" Marcus said nothing. His father looked up slowly, and for the first time in Marcus's memory, the man behind those eyes was not Robert Harrison, CEO, patriarch, self-made man. He was simply an aging father who had, perhaps, somewhere along the long road of his life, made a terrible and quiet mistake. "Is that you?" his father asked. Marcus still said nothing. But his silence was its own answer. Robert Harrison had been raised by a man who believed that a son who followed in his father's footsteps was the highest honor a child could pay. He had watched his own father pour everything into the eldest, and had watched the other children drift into smaller, less celebrated lives. He had absorbed this as natural order, the way things were, the way they had always been, the way they would always be. He had never examined it, the way one doesn't examine the direction that water flows or the habit of breathing. But water could be redirected, and a father could spend 30 years pouring all his warmth in one direction while the people standing behind him quietly froze. He called Diane that evening. She was back in Charlotte, and he could hear her moving around her apartment in the background, the sound of cabinets opening, the television at low volume. He had never called her just to talk. They both understood, without saying so, that this phone call was different. "Diane," he said, "I want to ask you something." "Okay, Dad." "The lab supplies. For your school. How much did you spend?" A pause. He could hear her going still on the other end. "Over 2 years?" "About $8,000, give or take." "Out of your teacher's salary?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you ask me?" The question sat between them, fragile as glass. Diane let several seconds pass before she answered, and when she did, her voice was careful and honest in equal measure. "Because, Dad, I didn't think you'd see it as worth your investment. A public school in Charlotte. Your daughter, the science teacher." She paused. "I didn't want to give you the chance to suggest I run it through Brandon." Robert Harrison closed his eyes. "Drive carefully," he said, which made no sense since she was already home. Then he caught himself. "We'll talk soon." He hung up and sat in the darkening study, surrounded by the evidence of everything he had built, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to sit with something he had spent decades sidestepping. Not anger, not defensiveness, just the plain, quiet recognition of a man who has only just understood the true nature of what he has been doing all along. 3 months later, at the family's annual February dinner, a tradition Robert had started when the children were small, just the 5 of them, no extended family, no audience, no performance. Something shifted. The table was the same round table they'd always used. Carol's pot roast, made every year for this occasion, smelled exactly as it always had. The good dishes were out. But the man at the head of the table was changed in a way that none of his children could precisely identify, though all of them felt it the moment they sat down. He didn't speak right away. He let them eat, and he watched them, the way Brandon refilled Jennifer's water glass without being asked, the way Diane laughed with her whole body at something Marcus said, the way Marcus's hands moved even when he was eating, always expressive, always sketching something invisible in the air. Then Robert set down his fork. "I want to say something," he said. "I'm going to ask that nobody interrupt me, because it's hard to say, and I'm an old man and I might lose my nerve." The table went quiet. "I haven't been a fair father." His voice was steady, but the effort of keeping it that way was visible to everyone. "I've been a proud man. I'm still a proud man. But I've been proud of the wrong things, in the wrong direction. And I've caused real hurt to people I love." He looked at Diane, then at Marcus. "I've looked at this family for 30 years and seen what I wanted to see, not what was actually there. I saw a firstborn son, and I saw my legacy walking around. I saw a daughter, and I saw..." He stopped. Chose his words. I saw less than I should have. I saw a youngest child who didn't match the picture in my head, and I responded with disappointment instead of curiosity. That wasn't right. It wasn't fair. And it wasn't who I wanted to be. Marcus was looking at the tablecloth. Diane had gone completely still. Diane, his father continued, you spent $8,000 of your own money so that your students could learn properly. You didn't complain. You didn't ask me for anything. You just did it because that's who you are. I didn't see it. I'm sorry. He cleared his throat. Marcus, I showed your illustrations to someone, the owner of a gallery in Midtown Atlanta. She wants to exhibit the series in the spring. He paused. I told her I raised you, and I was proud to say it. I should have been saying it for years. Carol was crying, softly, composedly, the way she always did. Brandon spoke next. His voice was rough around the edges. Dad, there's something I should have said in November, right after Thanksgiving. He looked at his brother and sister, the controlling interest, the CEO title. I talked to Dad last month. It should be restructured, split between all three of us, as equal partners. He held Diane's gaze, then Marcus's. I should have said so the same night he announced it. I didn't. I'm sorry it took me this long. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Marcus, who had been quiet for the last several minutes, said simply, I don't actually want to run a trucking company. And somehow, in the middle of all that weight and gravity, the whole table laughed, a real laugh, the kind that carries relief in it, and old pain, and the peculiar tenderness of people who have known each other long enough to be fully, honestly, themselves. Then what do you want? His father asked. Marcus finally looked up. A proper studio. Good north-facing light. And for you to stop telling people you'll sundoodles for a living. Robert Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then, with visible effort, he said the thing that perhaps mattered more than anything else spoken at that table that night. You're an artist and you're my son. I'm going to learn to say both of those things with the same pride. 3 years after that February dinner, the Harrison house on Elm Drive had not changed its bones. The oak tree in the front yard was still the same oak tree. The Sunday dinners still happened. Robert still sat at the head of the table. But certain things were different, if you knew where to look. On the wall of the study, where a large framed photo of Robert shaking hands with the governor of Georgia had always hung, there were now 6 framed illustrations, warm golds and cool blues, a father and 3 children. The series was titled Hierarchy on the small brass plate beneath them, but someone had added a subtitle in smaller lettering, and what we built instead. In a studio space in Buckhead, a ground-floor unit with tall, north-facing windows that Robert had quietly signed the lease on without being asked, Marcus worked most mornings. His client list had grown to include agencies in London, Toronto, and São Paulo. Robert had attended the Midtown Gallery opening in April, stood in the front row during the artist's talk, and introduced himself to strangers as the artist's father. He had practiced saying it until it came easily. It had taken some time. Most important things do. Diane's school in Charlotte had received a significant donation through the Harrison Family Foundation, filed in the spring, sufficient to build and stock a proper biology lab for the next several years. When Diane called her father, he said only, it was long overdue, which was, for Robert Harrison, as close to an apology in action as he had ever come. She accepted it for exactly what it was. Brandon remained exactly who he had always been, a good oldest son, a capable businessman, and had taken on one additional role, the sibling who noticed things, who called Marcus when a brand reached out looking for an illustrator, who made sure Diane's name came up at family gatherings, who had learned, through the slow discomfort of honest self-examination, to share the spotlight that had always found him so naturally. And Carol? She still woke before 6. She still cooked on Sundays. She still knew which of her children was hurting before they said a word. But there was something lighter in how she moved through the house now. something that had been held tight for a very long time and had finally, mercifully, been allowed to breathe. The Harrison house was still the kind of home the neighborhood talked about, but it was also, now, something it had never quite managed to be before. It was a fair house. Not a perfect one, no houses. Robert still brightened in a particular way when Brandon walked in, and old habits of pride are not easily unlearned at 68. There were still moments of imbalance. Still the occasional dinner that required a conversation afterward. Still the daily, imperfect, deeply human work of a family choosing to see its own members clearly. But the choosing was happening, and in a family, as in most things worth keeping, the choosing is everything.